She went missing for 5 years, but when the detective finally found her, the truth was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. What would you do if the people you were desperately searching for turned out to be the masterminds behind their own disappearance? It was October 15th, 2006. Lydia and Ethan Vance had just said, "I do," in what everyone called the perfect wedding. Lydia, a 26-year-old aspiring photographer with dreams bigger than her small hometown, had finally found her soulmate in Ethan, a brilliant 28-year-old software developer whose startup was gaining serious attention from investors. Their families watched them drive away in Ethan's silver Honda Accord, heading to a romantic cabin retreat in the Pacific Northwest for their honeymoon. "We'll call you when we get there," Lydia had shouted from the passenger window, her wedding ring catching the sunlight as she waved goodbye. Those would be among the last words her family would ever hear her speak. The cabin they had rented sat nestled among towering Douglas firs, 3 hours from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where cell phone service was spotty, and the closest neighbor was miles away. Perfect for a romantic getaway, perfect for disappearing without a trace. On October 17th, Lydia's mother, Patricia, received what would become the most haunting voicemail of her life. Lydia's voice was bright, full of laughter. "Mom, this place is absolutely magical. Ethan just made the most incredible breakfast, and we're planning to hike to the waterfall today. The weather is perfect. I can't wait to show you the pictures when we get back. Love you." But they never came back. What happened next would launch one of the most baffling missing persons cases in Pacific Northwest history. When Lydia and Ethan failed to check out of their cabin on October 19th, the property manager, a gruff ex-logger named Bill Henderson, drove up the winding forest road to check on them. What he found defied all logic. The cabin looked like the couple had simply stepped outside for a moment and planned to return any second. The coffee maker was still on, a full pot of coffee burnt to the bottom. An open book lay face down on the wooden table, The Art of Landscape Photography, with Lydia's reading glasses folded neatly beside it. Ethan's laptop sat open on the couch, still displaying a half-finished email to a business partner about their upcoming product launch. Their car was parked in the driveway, keys hanging from the ignition. All their luggage remained unpacked in the bedroom. Lydia's camera equipment was scattered across the bed, as if she'd been sorting through lenses. 2 wine glasses sat on the kitchen counter, one still half full of Pinot Noir, the other containing only dried red residue. Most chilling of all, there were no signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no blood. The front door was unlocked, but there was no evidence of forced entry. It was as if Lydia and Ethan Vance had simply vanished into the endless expanse of forest surrounding their cabin. Bill Henderson had seen a lot in his 63 years, but nothing had prepared him for this. He immediately called the local sheriff's department, his hands shaking as he dialed. "You need to get up here right now," he told the dispatcher. "Something's not right. Something's very, very not right." But little did anyone know, this was only the beginning of a mystery that would consume the next 5 years of Detective Sarah Collins' life. Detective Sarah Collins was only 29 when the Vance case landed on her desk, but she had already earned a reputation as one of the most tenacious investigators in the department. She had grown up in small-town Oregon, where everyone knew everyone, and missing persons cases usually ended with someone found sleeping off a bender in a friend's barn, or discovered safe at a relative's house after a family argument. This was different. This was the kind of case that would either make her career or haunt her forever. Sarah threw herself into the investigation with an intensity that worried her colleagues. She interviewed everyone who had ever known Lydia and Ethan. Their families painted a picture of the perfect couple, madly in love, financially stable, with bright futures ahead of them. Lydia's father, a retired bank manager, insisted his daughter had never been happier. Ethan's business partner swore that Ethan was more excited about his company's future than he had ever seen him. They were planning to start a family. Patricia Vance told Sarah through tears during their third interview. Lydia had stopped taking birth control. She was already picking out baby names. "Detective, you have to understand. My daughter would never just disappear. Never. Sarah organized search parties that combed through hundreds of acres of dense forest. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the wilderness. Search dogs picked up the couple's scent near the cabin, but lost it completely about 50 yards into the tree line, as if Lydia and Ethan had simply evaporated. 3 months into the investigation, Sarah had interviewed 47 people, followed up on 62 tips from the public, and watched over 300 hours of security footage from gas stations and convenience stores along every possible route the couple might have taken. Every single lead had crumbled to dust in her hands. The media attention was intense at first. Nancy Grace devoted an entire week to the case. Missing honeymooners became a trending topic on early social media platforms. But as weeks turned to months with no new developments, the cameras moved on to fresher tragedies. October 2011. 5 years had passed since Lydia and Ethan Vance had disappeared without a trace. Sarah Collins was now a seasoned detective, her youthful optimism tempered by years of seeing humanity's darkest side. She had solved dozens of cases, earned 2 commendations, and gained the respect of every officer in the department. But the wedding photo of Lydia and Ethan still hung on her bulletin board. Some cases, Sarah had learned, never truly go cold. They just hibernate in the back of your mind, waiting for the right moment to spring back to life. That moment came on a gray October morning, when Sarah's phone rang at 7:43 a.m. The caller was James Morrison, a private investigator from Seattle. "Detective Collins, my name is James Morrison. I've been hired by Patricia Vance, Lydia Vance's mother. I think I have something you need to see." Sarah's pulse quickened. She had spoken to Patricia just 6 months earlier on the 5th anniversary of the disappearance. The woman had aged 20 years in 5, her hopes slowly dying like a candle, burning down to its wick. If she had hired a private investigator, she was making one last desperate attempt to find answers. "What kind of something?" Sarah asked. "A hiker found a camera 3 days ago, about 200 miles south of where your couple went missing. It's been in the elements for years, but the memory card is intact. Detective Collins, the camera belongs to Lydia Vance." Sarah felt her world shift. After 5 years of silence, the Vance case was speaking again. 2 hours later, Sarah sat in her office staring at a water-damaged Nikon digital camera. Morrison had driven down from Seattle personally to deliver it. The camera body was corroded beyond repair, but the SD card had been protected inside its metal housing. "The hiker who found it is a retired forest ranger," Morrison explained. "He knew enough about evidence preservation to handle it properly." The photos date from October 2006, right around the time of their disappearance. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she inserted the memory card into her computer. What secrets had this camera been keeping buried in the forest for 5 long years? What she was about to discover would shatter everything she thought she knew about Lydia and Ethan Vance. The first images that appeared on Sarah's computer screen were exactly what she expected to see. Lydia and Ethan at their cabin, looking like the perfect honeymooning couple. Ethan making pancakes in the small kitchen, his hair still messy from sleep. Lydia by the window, capturing the morning light filtering through the trees, their faces glowing with happiness and love. But as Sarah clicked through the photographs, the mood began to shift. Image 47 showed Ethan standing outside the cabin, his posture rigid, his face turned away from the camera. Image 48 captured Lydia in profile, her expression troubled, her mouth set in a hard line. By image 52, they were clearly in the middle of an argument. Ethan's face was flushed red, his finger pointing accusingly at something off camera. Lydia's eyes were wide, her hands raised defensively. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, leaning closer to her monitor. The final sequence of photos was disturbing in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. Image 58 was blurry, obviously taken in haste or panic. It showed Lydia's face close to the camera, her eyes wide with unmistakable terror. But it was what lurked in the background that made Sarah's blood run cold. A shadowy figure stood behind Lydia, partially obscured by the cabin's interior. In the figure's raised hand was the unmistakable silhouette of a hunting knife. Sarah immediately called Morrison. I need you to find out everything you can about who else was in that area during October 2006. Workers, hikers, hunters, anyone. We're looking for a man with a criminal history involving violence. While Morrison worked his contacts, Sarah dove into databases of known criminals in the Pacific Northwest. It took her less than 6 hours to find him. Ray Kowalski, age 34 in 2006. Multiple arrests for assault and battery. He had worked seasonal jobs at various logging camps and hunting lodges throughout Oregon and Washington. Most importantly, he had been employed at a hunting outfitter just 15 miles from where Lydia and Ethan had been staying. When Sarah pulled his mugshot from a 2005 arrest, her heart nearly stopped. The facial structure, the build, even the way he held his shoulders. It was a perfect match for the shadowy figure in Lydia's final photograph. After 5 years of dead ends and false leads, Sarah finally had a suspect. But catching Ray Kowalski would prove to be more complicated than she could have ever imagined. Ray Kowalski was not a hard man to find. In 5 years he had barely moved, working the same circuit of seasonal jobs, drinking at the same dive bars, living in the same rundown trailer park outside of Bend, Oregon. What surprised Sarah was how easily he agreed to come in for questioning. "Yeah, I remember that couple," Kowalski said, settling his bulky frame into the metal chair across from Sarah in the interrogation room. "Pretty girl, nerdy guy. They came by the outfitter looking for hiking maps." Sarah's partner on the case, Detective Frank Rosty, leaned forward at 55. Frank had seen every type of criminal and knew how to spot deception. "Ray, we have evidence that places you at their cabin. We have photographs." Kowalski's demeanor shifted instantly. His casual confidence evaporated, replaced by the twitchy nervousness of a cornered animal. "What kind of photographs?" Sarah slid a printed copy of the final image across the table. Kowalski stared at it for a long moment, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with tears. "I never meant for any of it to happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What followed was a confession that seemed to solve the 5-year-old mystery. According to Kowalski, he had gone to the cabin on October 17th, planning to rob the wealthy city couple. He claimed he had been drinking heavily and was desperate for money. But when he arrived, he found Ethan and Lydia in the middle of a heated argument about money. Apparently, Ethan's business was failing, and they were facing financial ruin. "The guy went crazy when he saw me," Kowalski continued. "Started screaming about how I was going to ruin everything. He grabbed a kitchen knife and came at me. I had to defend myself. I hit him with a piece of firewood, hit him too hard." Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. After 5 years, she finally had answers for the Vance families. What about Lydia? She saw the whole thing. She was screaming, crying. "I panicked. I thought she was going to call the police. I grabbed her, told her to calm down. She fought me, and I lost control. I didn't mean to hurt her, but she wouldn't stop screaming." Kowalski broke down completely, sobbing into his hands. "I buried them both in the forest. I've been carrying this guilt for 5 years. Every day, I wake up thinking about what I did to those people." Sarah should have felt relief. The case that had consumed 5 years of her life was finally solved. But something nagged at her. A small voice in the back of her mind that insisted the story didn't quite add up. That voice would prove to be more important than she could have ever imagined. 2 days later, Ray Kowalski led a team of detectives and forensic specialists to a remote section of forest about 3 miles from the cabin where Lydia and Ethan had been staying. The area was dense with undergrowth and fallen logs, the kind of place where human remains could stay hidden for decades. "It was here," Kowalski said, pointing to a slight depression in the ground beneath a massive Douglas fir. "I buried them both right here." The forensics team began their careful excavation, while Sarah watched from a distance. After 5 years of wondering, she was finally going to be able to give the Vance families closure. She was finally going to bring Lydia and Ethan home. But as the team dug deeper, Sarah's sense of anticipation turned to confusion, then to growing alarm. The grave was empty, completely empty. "There's nothing here," the lead forensic specialist told Sarah after they had excavated down 4 feet. No remains, no clothing, no personal effects. Nothing. Kowalski stared at the empty hole in shock. They were here, I swear to God. They were here, I buried them myself. But the forensics team did find something. About 2 feet down, caught in the disturbed soil, was a small gold locket. Sarah's hands shook as she examined it through the evidence bag. It was delicate, antique-looking, with an intricate floral design etched into the surface. This belonged to Lydia. Patricia Vance confirmed when Sarah called her that evening. It was my grandmother's. Lydia never took it off. But when the forensics lab analyzed the locket, they discovered something that changed everything. The piece of jewelry had been in the ground for less than a year. Someone had planted it in the makeshift grave recently, very recently. Ray Kowalski had been manipulated. His confession was worthless. The real killer was still out there, and they had been playing games with the investigation. Sarah stared at the evidence report until her eyes burned. 5 years of investigation, a confession that seemed to solve everything. And now she was back at square one. But this time, she knew someone was actively working against her. Someone who knew about the original investigation. Someone who had access to Lydia's personal belongings. Someone who wanted Ray Kowalski to take the fall for a crime he didn't commit. The question that kept Sarah awake that night was simple but terrifying. If Ray Kowalski didn't kill Lydia and Ethan Vance, then who did? And why were they so determined to frame an innocent man? Sarah spent the next week re-examining every piece of evidence from the original investigation with fresh eyes. If someone had planted Lydia's locket in Ray Kowalski's fake grave, they had intimate knowledge of both the case and Lydia's personal belongings. The list of people with that kind of access was surprisingly short. It was while reviewing her original interview notes that Sarah's attention was drawn to a detail she had previously overlooked. Lydia's uncle, Marcus Hayes, had mentioned during their conversation that the locket found in the grave was a replica of a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations. At the time, Sarah had thought nothing of his comment. Now it seemed significant. How had Marcus known that the locket was a replica without seeing it in person? Sarah pulled Marcus Hayes' file from the case archives. At 62 years old, Marcus was a successful antique dealer who owned several high-end shops in Portland and Seattle. He had never married, had no children, and lived alone in a sprawling estate outside the city. During the original investigation, he had been cooperative but distant, claiming he barely knew his niece despite being her only living relative on her father's side. But as Sarah dug deeper into Marcus's background, she discovered something interesting. In 2005, just 1 year before Lydia and Ethan's disappearance, Marcus had invested heavily in Ethan's software company. The investment had been substantial, nearly $500,000, and it had been kept secret from the rest of the family. Sarah's pulse quickened as she made another connection. According to business records, Ethan's company had declared bankruptcy just 2 weeks before the honeymoon trip. Marcus Hayes had lost his entire investment. That evening, Sarah drove to Marcus's estate, an imposing Victorian mansion, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. Marcus answered the door himself, looking exactly as she remembered him, tall, thin, impeccably dressed despite the late hour. "Detective Collins," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "What an unexpected pleasure. Have you finally made progress on my niece's case?" "Actually, Mr. Hayes, I'd like to ask you a few more questions about your relationship with Lydia and Ethan. Specifically, about your business relationship with Ethan." For just a moment, Sarah saw something flicker across Marcus's face. Fear, anger. It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. Detective, I barely knew the boy." But Sarah had been a detective for too long to miss the telltale signs of deception. Marcus Hayes was lying, and she was going to find out why. What she discovered next would reveal a web of greed, betrayal, and deception that would make the truth about Lydia and Ethan Vance more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Sarah spent the next 48 hours building a case against Marcus Hayes that was as airtight as she could make it. Bank records showed the $480,000 investment in Ethan's company. Phone records revealed dozens of calls between Marcus and Ethan in the weeks leading up to the honeymoon, calls that Marcus had never mentioned during his original interview. Most damning of all, Sarah discovered that Marcus owned a small cabin just 2 miles from where Lydia and Ethan had been staying. He had purchased it under a shell company, which explained why it hadn't appeared in the original investigation. When Sarah confronted Marcus at his estate for the second time, she brought backup and a warrant. "Marcus Hayes, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence in the disappearance of Lydia and Ethan Vance." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Marcus's carefully controlled facade finally cracked. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Detective, those two ruined my life. They deserved everything that happened to them." At the station, Marcus waived his right to an attorney and agreed to tell Sarah everything. What he revealed was a story of manipulation and betrayal that went far deeper than a simple investment gone wrong. "Ethan came to me in 2005, Marcus began, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "He needed capital for his software company. He promised me revolutionary technology that would make us both millions. I believed him. I liquidated assets, borrowed against my properties. I gave him everything." Sarah leaned forward, "But the company failed." "The company didn't fail, detective. Ethan and Lydia stole from it. They had been siphoning money from the business accounts for months, hiding it in offshore accounts. When I discovered what they were doing, I confronted them." Marcus's eyes grew cold. "I went to their cabin that night to demand my money back. I found them celebrating their successful theft, planning their new life with my stolen fortune. When I threatened to expose them, Ethan attacked me with a knife." Sarah felt the familiar chill of a case taking an unexpected turn. "You killed him in self-defense." "I killed him because he was a thief who tried to murder me when I caught him stealing." As for Lydia, Marcus smiled, and Sarah saw something truly frightening in that expression. "Lydia made me an offer I couldn't refuse." What Marcus revealed next would shatter every assumption Sarah had made about the case. The truth about what happened to Lydia and Ethan Vance was more twisted than any detective could have imagined. Lydia didn't witness Ethan's death. "Detective," Marcus continued, his voice taking on an almost proud tone, "she planned it." Sarah felt her world tilt. "What are you talking about?" "My dear niece was far more intelligent than anyone gave her credit for. She had been planning to leave Ethan for months. The theft from his company wasn't random. It was calculated. She needed seed money for a new life, and she needed Ethan out of the picture permanently." Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the shock on Sarah's face. "When I arrived at the cabin that night, I expected to find two thieves. Instead, I found one thief and one very clever young woman who had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to eliminate her problem." The story Marcus told was as brilliant as it was horrifying. Lydia had discovered that Ethan's software contained security flaws that would eventually be discovered, making their stolen money traceable. She needed a way to disappear completely, while ensuring that Ethan could never expose her or reclaim the funds. "She suggested we work together," Marcus explained. "I would help her fake both their deaths, and in exchange, she would return my investment plus interest." She even had the perfect patsy picked out, that drunk Ray Kowalski who had been harassing tourists in the area. Sarah's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. The photos on the camera, the argument between Lydia and Ethan, that was staged. Beautifully staged, wasn't it? Lydia was always artistic. She created the perfect narrative, a loving couple threatened by a dangerous stranger. She even took that final photograph herself, using a timer and clever positioning to make it look like someone else was holding the camera. But Marcus's expression darkened as he continued. "What I didn't anticipate was how thoroughly Lydia intended to double-cross me. Once Ethan was dead, and we had successfully staged their disappearance, she refused to return my money. She claimed it was payment for helping her escape her old life." Sarah felt sick as she realized the full scope of the deception. "Where is she now?" Marcus smiled that cold smile again. "That, detective, is the question that has been keeping me awake for 5 years. You see, Lydia Vance is still very much alive. She's been living quite comfortably on my stolen money, while I've been forced to slowly liquidate my life's work to avoid bankruptcy." Sarah stared at Marcus in horror. "You framed Ray Kowalski to draw her out of hiding. I planted that locket hoping the renewed investigation would flush her out. Lydia always was sentimental about family heirlooms. I thought if she believed someone was getting close to the truth, she might make a mistake, try to contact someone from her old life." Sarah stood up abruptly. "Where is Ethan's body?" "Gone. Lydia insisted we cremate him and scatter the ashes. No evidence, no body, no murder charge. Just a missing persons case that would eventually go cold." Marcus's voice turned bitter. She thought of everything. As Sarah processed Marcus's confession, one question burned in her mind. If Lydia Vance was still alive after 5 years, living under a new identity with stolen money, how was Sarah ever going to find her? The answer would come from the most unexpected source. With Marcus Hayes in custody and his confession recorded, Sarah faced the most challenging part of her investigation. How do you find someone who has had 5 years to establish a completely new identity and disappear into anonymity? The answer came from Detective Frank Rosty, Sarah's partner, who had been quietly working his own angle on the case. "Sarah, you need to see this," Frank said, bursting into the interrogation room where Sarah had been reviewing Marcus's statement. "I've been going through Ethan's computer files that we recovered from the cabin. Remember how we thought it was strange that his laptop was left open with that half-finished email?" Sarah followed Frank back to his desk, where Ethan's laptop was connected to the department's forensic analysis system. "That email wasn't half-finished," Frank continued. "It was deliberately deleted, but not completely. Our tech guys were able to recover the full message." On Frank's monitor was an email dated October 16, 2006, the day before Lydia and Ethan officially disappeared. The sender was Ethan Vance, and the recipient was someone named David Chen at a software company in Singapore. The email read, "David, I know this is short notice, but I need to accelerate our timeline. My partner is planning something that could destroy both of us. The money transfers need to happen tonight. Once you confirm receipt, delete all records of our communications. This has to look like the company failed naturally." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Ethan knew what Lydia was planning. Frank nodded grimly. "It gets worse. Look at this." He pulled up another recovered file, a draft email that was never sent. This one was addressed to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. "I have evidence that my business partner and my wife have been embezzling funds from our company and planning to fake our deaths to avoid prosecution. If something happens to me before I can submit this formally, please investigate Lydia Vance and Marcus Hayes for fraud and potentially murder." Sarah stared at the screen in disbelief. Ethan was trying to expose them both. According to these files, Ethan discovered the embezzlement about a week before their honeymoon. He was planning to turn them in, but he needed more evidence. He was using the honeymoon trip as cover to gather proof of the offshore accounts. Frank pulled up a third document, a detailed spreadsheet tracking money transfers between various accounts. Sarah, Ethan Vance wasn't a co-conspirator. He was the only honest person in this whole mess, and Lydia killed him to keep him quiet. But the most important discovery was yet to come. Hidden in Ethan's browser history were searches for private investigators specializing in locating people with false identities. He had bookmarked several websites for international banking regulations and extradition treaties. He was planning to find her. Sarah realized, even after she disappeared, he was going to track her down and bring her to justice. Frank smiled grimly. "And now we're going to finish what he started." The digital trail Ethan had left behind would prove to be the key to finding Lydia Vance, but tracking her down would lead Sarah into a web of international intrigue that would test every skill she had developed as a detective. Using Ethan's research as a starting point, Sarah contacted Interpol and began the painstaking process of tracking financial transactions across international borders. What she discovered was a trail of carefully orchestrated identity changes and money transfers that painted a picture of someone who had spent years planning the perfect disappearance. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, a financial investigator with the FBI's International Operations Division, had been tracking a series of suspicious transactions that matched the pattern Sarah was following. "We've been watching these accounts for 2 years," Maria told Sarah during a conference call. "The amounts, the timing, the routing through multiple countries. It all matches a case we've been building against an international money laundering operation." Sarah's hands trembled as she took notes. "Do you have a current location? We believe your suspect is living in Costa Rica under the name Elena Morales. She's been very careful, very smart, but she made one mistake. The mistake was sentimentality. Despite all her careful planning, Lydia had been unable to resist keeping one connection to her old life. Every year on her original wedding anniversary, she made a small donation to a photography scholarship fund at the community college where she had taken classes before meeting Ethan. The donations were always anonymous, always routed through multiple accounts to hide their origin. But Maria's team had finally traced them back to their source. "She's living in a luxury apartment in San Jose," Maria continued. "Expensive neighborhood, pays her rent in cash, keeps to herself. The local authorities have agreed to cooperate with an arrest." 3 days later, Sarah found herself on a plane to Costa Rica, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. After 5 years of investigation, false leads, and shocking revelations, she was finally going to come face to face with Lydia Vance. But nothing could have prepared her for what she would find when she knocked on the door of Elena Morales' apartment in San Jose. The woman who answered the door of apartment 412 in an upscale complex in San Jose looked nothing like the radiant bride in the wedding photo that had haunted Sarah's bulletin board for 5 years. This woman was older, harder, with expertly dyed black hair and the kind of deep tan that came from years of tropical living. But the eyes were unmistakable. Sarah had stared at those eyes in photographs for half a decade. "Lydia Vance," Sarah said, showing her badge. "Or should I call you Elena Morales?" The woman's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally, resignation. After a moment, she stepped aside and gestured for Sarah to enter. "I've been wondering when this day would come," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that hadn't been there 5 years ago. "Though I have to admit, I thought it would be Marcus who found me first." The apartment was luxurious but sterile, like an expensive hotel room. There were no personal photographs, no mementos from her past life, nothing that would connect Elena Morales to the woman who had once been Lydia Vance. "You know why I'm here," Sarah said. Lydia, Sarah couldn't think of her by any other name, poured herself a glass of wine with steady hands. "Marcus finally talked, didn't he? I always knew that pompous bastard would crack under pressure." Sarah studied the woman across from her. 5 years of living, a lie had changed her in ways that went far beyond physical appearance. This was not the scared, innocent victim Sarah had been searching for. This was a predator. "Tell me about Ethan," Sarah said. For the first time, Lydia's composed mask slipped. Pain flashed across her features, quickly replaced by cold anger. "Ethan was going to ruin everything," she said. "He discovered what Marcus and I were doing with the company funds. He was going to turn us both into the FBI." Sarah leaned forward. "So you killed him?" "Marcus killed him. I just didn't stop it." Lydia took a long sip of wine. "Ethan thought he was so noble, so righteous. He was going to destroy both our lives over money that the company was going to lose anyway. His precious software was riddled with security flaws. We would have been bankrupt within 6 months." Sarah felt disgust rise in her throat. "He was your husband. He was an obstacle." Lydia's voice was flat, emotionless. "Detective, I grew up poor. Really poor. Do you know what it's like to go to bed hungry? To wear the same clothes to school every day, because your parents can't afford anything else." Sarah didn't respond. "When I met Ethan, I saw my ticket out of that life. But his company was failing, and I wasn't going to go back to being poor. Not for anyone." Sarah stood up. "Lydia Vance, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and embezzlement." But as the handcuffs clicked around Lydia's wrists, she looked up at Sarah with something that might have been pity. "Detective, Do you really think any jury is going to convict a grieving widow who was manipulated by her predatory uncle? I'm the victim in this story, remember. Sarah felt a chill as she realized that even now, even caught red-handed, Lydia was still playing the game, and she might just be good enough to win. The trial of Lydia Vance became an international sensation. The woman who had been presumed dead for 5 years, the grieving families who had never given up hope, the web of deception that spanned multiple countries. It had all the elements of a Hollywood thriller. Lydia's defense team, led by renowned criminal attorney Victoria Chen, crafted a masterful narrative. Their client wasn't a cold-blooded killer. She was a naive young woman who had been manipulated and terrorized by her older, more sophisticated uncle. Marcus Hayes was the real mastermind. They argued Lydia was just another victim. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Victoria Chen said during her opening statement, "My client is not a criminal. She is a survivor for 5 years. Lydia Vance has lived in fear, hiding from a man who murdered her husband and threatened to kill her if she ever came forward." The defense painted Marcus Hayes as a controlling sociopath who had groomed his vulnerable niece from childhood, eventually manipulating her into participating in his schemes through a combination of financial dependence and psychological abuse. But prosecutor James Mitchell was ready for their strategy. He had spent months building a case that would expose Lydia's true nature to the world. "The defendant wants you to believe she's a victim," Mitchell told the jury during his opening statement. "But the evidence will show you that Lydia Vance is one of the most calculating criminals this court has ever seen. She didn't just steal money, she stole a life. She stole Ethan Vance's future, his dreams, his chance to see justice done." The prosecution's star witness was Detective Sarah Collins. Over 3 days of testimony, Sarah laid out the timeline of deception with methodical precision. The staged photographs, the planted evidence, the web of lies that had taken 5 years to unravel. But it was Ethan's recovered computer files that proved most damaging to Lydia's defense. When the jury heard Ethan's own words, his desperate attempts to expose the fraud, his plans to contact the FBI, they saw him not as a co-conspirator, but as a man trying to do the right thing. He knew she was going to kill him. Sarah testified, "Those files show that Ethan Vance spent the last week of his life trying to gather enough evidence to stop his wife and her uncle from destroying other innocent people." Lydia's defense team tried to discredit the digital evidence, arguing that the files could have been planted or fabricated, but forensic experts confirmed that the metadata was authentic. The files had been created on Ethan's laptop in October 2006, days before his death. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Lydia herself took the stand. For 4 hours, she wove a tale of abuse, manipulation, and fear that had several jurors in tears. She described growing up under Marcus's controlling influence, being groomed to trust him completely, living in terror after witnessing Ethan's murder. "I wanted to come forward," she said, her voice breaking, "every day for 5 years. I wanted to tell the truth. But Marcus made it clear that if I ever tried to contact my family or the police, he would kill them too. I couldn't live with that blood on my hands." But prosecutor Mitchell was ready for her performance. "Miss Vance," he said during cross-examination, "if you were truly afraid of Marcus Hayes, why did you continue to live on the money stolen from his investment?" Lydia's composure wavered. "I needed that money to survive, to stay hidden in a luxury apartment, taking expensive vacations, making charitable donations to photography scholarships." Mitchell's voice rose. "That doesn't sound like someone living in fear, Miss Vance. That sounds like someone living the high life on blood money." The exchange that sealed Lydia's fate came near the end of her testimony. "Miss Vance, do you feel any remorse for your husband's death?" For a moment, the mask slipped completely. Lydia's eyes flashed with the cold calculation that Sarah had seen in Costa Rica. "Ethan made his choice when he decided to betray me," she said. "He knew the consequences." The courtroom fell silent. In that single sentence, Lydia had revealed her true nature to the world. After 6 weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced Lydia Vance to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led her away in shackles, Lydia turned to look at Sarah one last time. There was no remorse in her eyes, no acknowledgement of the lives she had destroyed, only a cold calculation that seemed to say, "This isn't over." Marcus Hay received 25 years for his role in the conspiracy. At 67 years old, it was essentially a life sentence. Unlike Lydia, Marcus seemed genuinely broken by the experience. He had lost his fortune, his reputation, and his freedom in pursuit of revenge, against a woman who had outsmarted him at every turn. Ray Kowalski, the man who had been manipulated into confessing to crimes he didn't commit, received a settlement from the state for wrongful imprisonment, but no amount of money could give him back the 5 years he had spent believing he was a murderer. The Vance families finally had closure, but it came at a terrible price. Patricia Vance, Lydia's mother, died of a heart attack 2 months after the trial ended. She had spent 5 years hoping her daughter was alive, only to discover that the woman she mourned was a killer. Ethan's parents established a foundation in their son's name, dedicated to supporting young entrepreneurs and promoting ethical business practices. They couldn't bring their son back, but they were determined that his death would have meaning. For Detective Sarah Collins, the case that had defined her career was finally closed. The wedding photograph came down from her bulletin board, replaced by a picture of Ethan alone, taken from his company's website, showing him as he had been in life, hopeful, innovative, and honest. But Sarah's sense of closure was complicated by a nagging worry. During the trial, Lydia had made several references to insurance policies and contingency plans. Even from prison, she hinted that she still had cards left to play. 3 months after the sentencing, Sarah's fears proved justified. A package arrived at the police station, addressed to her personally. Inside was a single photograph and a brief note. The photograph showed a man Sarah didn't recognize, but the note made her blood run cold. "Detective Collins, you think you know the whole story, but you've only scratched the surface. Ethan wasn't the only one trying to expose the truth. There were others, and they're still out there. If anything happens to me in prison, they know what to do. This case isn't closed. It never will be. LV." Sarah stared at the note for a long time, then carefully placed it in an evidence bag. She had thought the Vance case was the most complicated mystery she would ever solve. She was beginning to realize it might have been just the beginning. 5 years later, Sarah Collins sat in her office as captain of detectives, looking out at the city she had sworn to protect. The Vance case had made her career, earning her promotions and recognition throughout law enforcement, but it had also changed her in ways she was still trying to understand. She had learned that the most dangerous criminals aren't always the ones who look evil. Sometimes they're the ones who smile at their own wedding photos, who make charitable donations, who cry convincing tears when the cameras are rolling. The case files for Lydia and Ethan Vance were stored in the basement archives now, officially closed, but Sarah kept copies of everything in a secure file cabinet in her office. Lydia's final note had proven prophetic. New evidence had surfaced over the years, suggesting that the conspiracy had reached further than anyone had imagined. There had been other victims, other young entrepreneurs who had trusted the wrong people and paid with their lives, other families who would never know what happened to their loved ones. Lydia Vance remained in maximum security prison, where she spent her days writing letters to journalists and documentary filmmakers, always hinting at deeper secrets, always claiming to be the real victim, in a story she couldn't quite bring herself to tell completely. Marcus Hayes had died in prison 2 years into his sentence, taking whatever remaining secrets he possessed to his grave. But the software that Ethan had been developing, the revolutionary security program that had started the whole deadly chain of events, had eventually been completed by his former colleagues. Today, it protected millions of people's financial data from criminals like the ones who had murdered its creator. Sarah often wondered what Ethan would think if he could see how his work had lived on, how his death had ultimately led to something positive. She hoped he would be proud that his sacrifice hadn't been meaningless. Late at night, When the station was quiet and she was alone with her thoughts, Sarah would sometimes take out the wedding photo of Lydia and Ethan Vance. She would study their faces, his open and trusting, hers beautiful but somehow cold, even in that moment of supposed happiness. The case had taught her that some people are born predators, capable of wearing any mask necessary to get what they want. They can smile at their victims, marry them, even convince them that they love them, all while planning their destruction. But it had also taught her that truth has its own power. Ethan Vance had died trying to expose the corruption around him, but his digital testimony had ultimately brought his killers to justice. Sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. Sarah closed the file and locked it away for another night. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new mysteries, new opportunities to fight for justice in an imperfect world. But she would never forget the lesson of Lydia and Ethan Vance, that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look exactly like the people we trust most. And sometimes, the only way to catch them is to never stop believing that the truth, no matter how long it takes to surface, will eventually come to light. The Vance case was closed, but its echoes would follow Sarah Collins for the rest of her career. Because once you've seen how deep human deception can go, you never stop looking for the lies hidden behind every smile. What do you think about this true crime stories? Comment, like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories.